All right, let's dive into something that's, well, it's pretty frustrating, isn't it? We're going to tackle this huge question today. Why, with all the climate plans and promises in the world, are we still falling so far behind on our goals? It turns out the problem might not be what we think it is at all.
I mean, this is the core paradox. You look around and there is absolutely no shortage of plans. You've got countries submitting their pledges, corporations publishing these big sustainability goals. There are more commitments than ever before. And yet somehow, the gap between what we say we're going to do and what actually happens just seems to keep getting wider.
And look, this isn't just a feeling we have. The numbers here they're pretty brutal. The UN's latest emissions gap report shows that with our current policies, we are on a path to a 2.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise by the end of the century. That is a full degree hotter than the 1.5 degree target everyone agreed to in Paris. So yeah, this number right here, it tells the whole story of that gap.
So what is going on? The State of Climate Action report basically backs this up, showing that we're off track on almost every single important indicator. So here's the crucial point. We're not dealing with a failure of planning. We're facing a massive failure of execution. The plans are there, on paper, but the actual implementation, it's broken.
Okay, so this brings us to our first big idea. What if the problem isn't about political will or even money, but something way more fundamental? There's an analyst, Vanessa Pérez-Cirera, who argues it's really about a gap in our collective skill set, a deep lack of capacity.
Now, what's so interesting about this quote is how it completely shifts our focus. It's suggesting that the desire, the will to act, is actually there. People in governments, in communities, in business, they genuinely want to see change. But the actual how-to, the practical know-how, is missing. The organizational structures and the human skills you need to turn a giant global goal into a real local project, they just aren't there.
So what are we actually talking about here? What are these missing skills? Well, it's things like being able to see the whole system, not just one little problem at a time. It's about leadership that's spread throughout a community, not just stuck at the top. It's about actually knowing how to translate some massive abstract global goal into something that makes sense on the ground. And maybe most importantly, it's about having the emotional intelligence to manage this huge, scary transition for real people, and having a genuine respect for local and indigenous wisdom.
Okay, but let's push this a little further. What if this skills gap isn't even the root cause? What if it's actually just a symptom of something way deeper? A fundamental mismatch in how we even see the world. And this slide right here, it just gets to the absolute heart of it. Our modern institutions, our governments, our economies, they were all designed to work in a world that they saw as linear, predictable, kind of like a machine. You pull this lever, you get that result. Simple. But the planet, the Earth itself, doesn't work that way at all. It's a complex, messy, interconnected web of systems. And because of that fundamental mismatch, our systems are they're not built for this. They are structurally incapable of dealing with the reality of the climate crisis. Things like sudden tipping points, where one small change triggers this huge cascade of effects. Our neat and tidy systems just can't keep up. So if our modern model is broken, where do we look for a new one? Well, maybe the blueprint we need isn't new at all. There's this idea called the ecology of the sacred, and it suggests that ancient cultures actually developed incredibly sophisticated systems for managing this exact kind of complexity. At the core of this is a learning loop called SEMA. It starts with computing, which is just observing and gathering data from the world around you. Then you infer. You look for patterns in those observations over long periods of time. Next, you model. You build stories, myths, cultural ideas that capture that deep understanding of reality. And finally, you act. You use those stories, those models, to make decisions that ensure your community's survival. This wasn't magic. It was a rigorous, constantly adapting process. Now get this, because this is a really powerful idea. It reframes these ancient traditions not as quaint relics, but as incredibly effective, time-tested systems for managing long-term risk. Think about it. In environments full of uncertainty, which sounds a lot like our climate today, these traditions were designed to prevent the exact kind of total system collapse that our modern approach is flirting with. And just to be super clear, when we say sacred traditions here, we're not just talking about religion. We're talking about their practical function. The rituals, the stories, the taboos, they weren't random. They were actually a kind of technology for encoding ecological wisdom, for spreading risk out over generations, and for syncing up an entire society with the living world it depended on. Okay, so let's pull these two big threads together.
On one hand, we've got this modern diagnosis of missing practical skills. On the other, we have this ancient blueprint for a totally different way of seeing the world. So, how do they connect? And here's where it all clicks into place. Those practical skills we talked about earlier, systems thinking, distributed leadership, they are absolutely essential. But you can't just bolt them onto a system that's built on a completely opposite worldview. It won't work. They need fertile ground to grow. And that ground? It's an entirely different way of understanding our place in the world.
This slide just lays it out so perfectly. It's about moving from a worldview that sees nature as this separate thing out there for us to manage and control, to a worldview that finally understands that humans are just one small part of a much larger, living, breathing network.
And when you make that mental shift, suddenly all those skills we talked about earlier, they mean something totally different. Systems thinking stops being just a tool and becomes the way you see everything. Distributed leadership becomes the natural result of being deeply connected to your community. You start to value local wisdom not just because it's cultural, but because it's a vital source of long-term data. And you realize that our own emotional health is completely tied up with the health of our planet.
So, all of this really leads us to one big final question. Maybe our failure to act isn't really about policy or technology or money. Maybe the single most important climate action we can possibly take is to fundamentally change the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what our relationship with the Earth truly is.